Welcome to week 2 of business plans. If the key word for last week, as we focused on benchmarking, was around the word understanding, then this week we shift our attention to the actual business plan itself. The key word for this week that we'll be focusing on is the word credibility. How do we gain you credibility? How do we make your plan look credible? With the ultimate goal that we actually go and get it approved and supported by people that we're going to need involved in this plan. So let's actually start with how we're going to start this business plan. How are we going to first identify this innovation, particularly if you don't have one already identified, that you need to develop one? One way of going about actually doing this is to actually look at both your internal operations or what you're good at, as well as what's going on, for example, within the marketplace or maybe within the political environment. And one of the best ways to do this is by something called a SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And most of you would have done these many times over, either in other classes or maybe within your professional life. So I'm not going to talk too much about the actual core concepts of it. What I will say to you though is that probably the area that I see most people struggle with SWOT analysis is trying to work out under which heading do you put an item. Do you put it under a strength or is it really an opportunity? What I will say to you is that the location itself is not so important. And yes, it's very, very true. You actually will find times when the SWOT itself, you will have the same old item mentioned many times over under different headings. But if you want a general approach or general guideline that I've tended to use in terms of looking at SWOT analysis in the past, I tend to think of things which are really looking internally, the more navel-gazing kind of approach at the organisation. So how I'm operating, what my IT capabilities are. I tend to look at those as more strengths and weaknesses. When I'm talking about things external to the organisation, such as maybe technological advancements, political environment, or maybe just changes in the competitive landscape, I tend to factor those under opportunities and threats. As I said, that's a very, very general rule. If it helps you, great. If it doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily go and change the way in which you've done things in the past. Certainly when you're doing a SWOT analysis, and certainly in particular when you don't have details in terms of what you're proposing, or you're starting off with feel like you're starting off with a blank canvas, building a SWOT analysis, you can come up with a myriad of items. And words that I tend to use in going out there and identifying appropriate items that I would put on my blank canvas is the word I observe. I observe or I see, so that what I'm doing is I'm very objectively trying to capture that information that I need, that's going to necessarily help me frame or make a decision around a certain innovation that I'm going to go out there and actually put in place. That's certainly one way of doing it, and I would recommend it again if you're going out there and starting with a blank canvas. But ultimately, you want to transfer that SWOT analysis somewhere. You want to go and transfer it to your business report. And so what you need to do with the business report is not put up everything that you've observed, but really try and target that SWOT analysis down or tailor it such that it goes and supports your arguments around the change that you're proposing. Remember, you're focusing on credibility, and credibility means selling your change. So focusing your change on the key items that are more supporting arguments to the change, as opposed to a litany or smorgasbord of changes, is very, very integral part in terms of helping frame or focus your readers' attention around the elements that they should be concerned about and the proposal that you're actually putting out there. So that gets us part the way there. What it does is it helps identify our arguments. How we go about actually positioning those arguments and determining what should be included in the report, one way of doing it is through this stakeholder analysis. What a stakeholder analysis is, and many again of you would have done these either in other classes or within your professional life, But what is stakeholder analysis? It goes through and it grids out levels of interest and levels of influence that individuals or parts of the organisations or groups may have around your change. These levels of interest and level of influence may be both positive and negative. They will definitely be dynamic as people change their focus levels or their attention or what is critical to them on a certain particular period of time. And so is something that is going to be very dynamic that you're going to need to be aware of and continue to be changing. When we talk about level of interest, we definitely want to talk about reality. We don't want to talk about what they should have based on their position, based on their hierarchy, based on the fact that we find it interesting and so therefore others should. We talk about focusing on reality because what we want to do is we want to make sure that we use this stakeholder analysis to help us in tailoring our selling approach, our communication style, to maybe focus or change that level of interest into the appropriate way that we need it to be. When we talk about level of influence or power, we tend to be focusing on not just their hierarchical power, but it could also relate to things like their ability to influence other people's or set other people's or groups' opinions. And it could also be in relation to their knowledge-based power. The real point of doing this stakeholder analysis is to help you position or understand what are the key elements of your innovation and therefore your solution to it and your arguments, your presentation of your SWOT analysis and your change to touch points or key things that will hit these stakeholders, will get them interested in going through and hopefully supporting your change. As part of your change management classes, we did something around Kotter's model of change, and we introduced the 8 elements of change management that we went through. Probably the one that's the most important that everybody tends to get around or glass around is this whole idea of creating a sense of urgency. And what creating a sense of urgency means is how do you relate or how do you make your change relatable to somebody that you're trying to convince who is important in either supporting your change, whether it be from a financial point of view or from a resource perspective, or maybe it's just in terms of going out there and giving you time or setting opinions that you need around supporting your change and giving you that perspective. So when we talk about creating a sense of urgency, let me give you a perspective or an example of something that is not very successful at creating a sense of urgency. And it's that little thing that happens about 7 o'clock every night at dinner time, to which you may have a no-call file. And that is this whole idea around call centres. Call centres it's understood that they will have a low success rate in terms of selling you things. And one of the reasons why they have that low success rate is because when they make the calls to you, what they're doing is they're really selling you that bright, shiny new toy. They're not able to go and position it against maybe a set of problems that you're experiencing or maybe some set of opportunities that you should be looking at. And so what they do is they don't create that excitement, and call centers typically have a very, very low conversion rate. Let's fast forward to you in business. You are dealing with a proposal. You are dealing with something that you are presenting to senior management. In our class, you are dealing with establishing a successful franchise chain, but your first objective has to be just to get your proposal approved. You need to tailor it. You need to package it. You need to position it based on what is or will be the key concerns of those particular stakeholders. What is it that they are going to be focused on? So let me move you on to the change itself. Last week I focused you very much on this, or introduced you to this idea of a balanced scorecard. The reasoning behind introducing you to the balanced scorecard is businesses today tend to want to break down the essential elements of their financials. Looking purely at profit doesn't tell them enough. And the way in which they break it down is they break it down into componentary parts. around customer, which is very much focused on revenue and how they're going to go about actually driving that revenue, around cost, which is the operating efficiencies, the speed of execution, the amount of resources they're wasting, the amount of roadblocks that they would have in their organization, and then the element of learning or innovation, their sustainability, their ability to react or be proactive in terms of changing within the market, and then their speed of execution of adapting to it. I also introduced you to this idea of a maturity model, and the maturity model framework comes in various shapes and forms. The one that I mentioned last week had the core essence, in fact they all do, of speed of actually being able to adapt to change, and a level of predictability versus reactive nature. When we're talking about a balanced scorecard, what we're talking about is two elements. Number one, value. You've got to have metrics built in that ultimately end up with dollars and cents. Coming in and saying that you are going to focus on profit doesn't really break it down to the essential elements. You need to break it down into the elements of either revenue and or cost. And sometimes your change will impact both elements. That's okay, but you need to break it down into the elements of revenue and cost. The other thing you need to have in terms and value is dollar values, dollar amounts that you're actually specifying. And when we go through and we look at dollar values, we tend to think of this concept of materiality. When we're talking about materiality and benefits that you're going to drive, and therefore the costs associated with obtaining those benefits, we tend to talk, financial people use this term materiality, which is very much in relation to size. Size, the best example I can give you of this is when we're talking materiality, that if I gave $1,000 to James Packer, who's a multi-billionaire, it probably wouldn't make much difference to his life. And so therefore it would be considered immaterial or irrelevant to him. But if I offered $1,000 to each of you listening to this video, you'd probably rub your hands for jumping for joy, thinking, great, it's something that we can spend on, whether it be on luxury items, whether it be on essential items. So materiality is something you need to consider in terms of determining whether or not your change is being presented, number one, at the right level, and number two, whether or not it's something that you're going to get interest around from the particular stakeholders. The other thing that you need to build into your innovation is a level of timeliness. And when we talk about timeliness, we're talking about speed of execution, speed of deployment, speed of actually getting it from concept stage to endpoint. We these days tend to think of timelines as being shorter rather than longer. 25 years ago, long term was about 10 years. Currently, it's about 3 years. When we talk about short term, we tend to talk about things being no longer or not much greater than 3 to 6 months. So your innovation needs to be driving its benefits within those time frame periods. What's driving those shorter time frames? Probably three variables. Number one, level of expectation. We are very much geared towards expecting things to be better, cheaper, faster. And so therefore we expect it with anything that we're proposing that it will meet those criteria. Number two is lifespans. And if I give you a couple of comparisons on lifespans, when I'm talking about lifespans, I'm talking about lifespans of key stakeholders within the organization. So the chief financial officer, CFO, head honcho of finance within any organization has a lifespan of about 5 years, 9 months. They're measured on the share price. So having something that goes beyond their lifespan is not something that you're typically going to get support for. Governments are another classic example. We had in the 50s and 60s, we had the Liberal Party in power for 26 years. That's unheard of today. We not only change prime ministers, we tend to change parties every single election. So you need to be focused very much around delivering that benefit sooner rather than later. The other thing driving the shorter timelines is technology. And technology, particularly if you're going out there and producing something as an innovation, which most of you will, involving technology, then if it's something that's going to take multiple years to do, by the time you actually go and deploy it, not only has the market possibly moved on, but also the technology may be obsolete. So this is very, very consistent with why Agile has become certainly a methodology beyond software development, but really a focus of businesses as they go about actually presenting their solutions to the marketplace and internally. Last week also, in terms of building our innovation cycle, we introduced you to this concept of a sales funnel. And what I'll do is I'll put some information on the Moodle which will help you understand a couple of organizations' sales funnels that you should look at. One of the essential elements of sales funnels is this whole thing of breaking down your innovation into how you're going to attract and keep customers. And if you think about it, your particular assessment is focused on you going about actually setting up a franchise business for a cafe. Simply opening doesn't necessarily mean customers are going to come running in the door, particularly if you're a new brand, which is what you are. What you've got to think about is you've got to think about awareness around how you're going to gain as a customer walks past your shop and they're going to portray an image that you want to level set in their mind. How you do that is you need to think about your critical success factors. What is it that's important to driving your business? And simply selling coffee to customers is not getting specific enough. You need to be thinking about how it is as they walk past your store, how if they glance, they're going to recognize what it is you sell and the image you're trying to portray, whether it be fast coffee, cheap coffee, premium service, whether it be an ambience that says come in and sit down. One of the things that you will do in order to do that, or is critical to that, is your logo and design and slogan. And what I would encourage you to do as you're going through and building that logo is we tend to get a little bit too fixated on the artistic side of it and a lot less around what image are we trying to portray to the customer that will get them past the first phase of awareness and into the stopping, going into our store to buy, keeping them coming back, and then becoming sellers on behalf of us. Another important element of your business plan that you need to consider is impact. What is the impact statement? And again, determining the impact statement comes back to the stakeholder and what it is that's key in their mind or key criteria that they're considering. What problems are they focusing on that you're going to sell? What opportunities do they see that you're going to fix? And again, getting back to that whole statement around credibility, when we talk about impact statement, impacts need to be focused again around key performance indicators, things which are measurable, things that have a timeline. It's okay to go and measure revenue. What's not okay is to say things like maximize revenue. What you need to do is you need to be able to come up with either a dollar value or a percentage change in which, in this case, you'll improve the revenue by. But if you're going and putting percentage changes, what I would also encourage you to do is put a base level against which you're comparing to. So on a base of $1 million, you're looking to increase revenue by 10%, for example. The other element you need to factor in terms of your impact statement is a level of timeliness. What is the timeline that you need to do? And as I mentioned before, you need to consider materiality. A couple of other things you want to consider in terms of your time is your transition plan. And we talked a lot about this during the subjects of change management. For those of you that don't understand transition planning, what it is it's really how do I get people doing a particular line of work today or customers that are going into a certain cafe today, how long is it going to take me to actually get them converted to coming into my franchise? In setting this transition period, which ultimately will be the time part of your key performance indicator, you need to be thinking two variables, and two variables ultimately do impact the amount of time it will take to transition. Number one is the number of people that your change will impact. So if it's going to impact a larger number of people, it's going to take longer. If I have to get 1,000 people to do something, it's going to take them a lot longer to change how they're doing it than if I've only got to change 5 people from doing something. Stands to reason. The other thing that you've got to consider is the degree of change. How much are we swinging the pendulum from the way in which people are currently doing things to the way in which they're going to do things in the future? And this is where we get into things like barriers to change. People will change, but it takes time. The bigger the change, the more the change in their habit you're trying to create, the longer that will take to put in place. And so there's 2 things that you need to consider in terms of setting the time aspect of when you'll go and actually achieve your KPIs that you were trying to establish within your business plan. And again, remember the operative word that we're positioning here. We're after credibility. We're after it's justifiable. We're after credibility and belief in your plan. Hence why it's important that you are considering these factors as you're building your proposal. Another key area of your business plan that you need to consider is your risk management. What are the key risk items that will be around you actually going and executing and achieving these particular proposal that you're putting in place? One way of looking at your risk management plan is you had certain drivers that were pushing your change, and you would have identified those within your original SWOT analysis. And some of them will be because of the changes in market, maybe customer base, maybe profiling. Some of them will be as a result of technological change, which has probably been the biggest driver. Some of them will be because of changes in the political or legislative environment. And one classic example of that is around the current trade wars that are going on and how that's going to change the way in which we do business. Maybe it's just around the desire to get better. And I mentioned before the fact of the short lifespans today of people in public office, whether it be public companies or government organisations. In terms of going through and looking at your risks, is the way which I would suggest you to do it is to actually go back to your SWOT analysis, to actually go back and look at the elements that were pushing you in towards of going and determining that you needed this innovation to start with, determining your proposal, determining your approach to trying to make things, in this particular case, trying to deploy your cafe franchise. What were reasons why you did it in the first place? In terms of looking at risks, you've got to remember that as you're going out there and deploying your cafe, that maybe the technology that you were proposing doesn't become available. So what's going to be your backup plan? Maybe your competitors are actually going out there at the moment and establishing ways in which they're going to protect against you. We recently saw that with Amazon.com into Australia, where lobbyists such as Jerry Harvey from Harvey Norman was trying to protect his base by pushing the GST on online purchases for under $1,000. These are strategies that were put in place to preserve a proposal out there in the retail market. Again, really important in terms of going out there and analysing risks is that you focus your efforts and energy on the ones which will have major impact or change the way in which you will actually go about and actually do your proposal. In terms of your strategies, you need to have backup plans. And you need to have backup plans for a couple of reasons. Number one, you want to be able to react or know when to react to changing conditions before you actually get to it. And this is very important in today's market, as we're certainly challenged with time poor. You will have challenges around your resources and your implementation timeline for your proposal. So being able to work out what you will do if a certain thing comes up adds game plan and makes you more effective in terms of going out there and implementing upon your plan. But probably the bigger reason for this particular subject is, again, gets back to credibility. If you've got no concept of how you're going to react to market changes, if you don't have a backup strategy, then what you're doing is you've got a hole in your business report that an oops moment certainly doesn't add credibility to either yourself or the proposal that you're trying to put out there. So again, important reason to put these within your report. Mostly up to now, we've been focused very much on the benefit side of things, whether it be from the benefit in terms of increasing revenue or reducing cost. But now I want to shift our attention to the cost side of the equation. And what I'm talking largely about here is resources. When we talk about resources, we're talking about two particular types of resources. We're talking about people, the human side, and we're talking about the physical side, things that aren't people. We tend to break resources or physical resources down into a couple more categories, in that we tend to focus or talk about them in terms of being either fixed assets or being inventory. Simple way of thinking about a fixed asset is something that you're not necessarily in the business of selling, but what it does is it helps you sell other things. So if you think about your cafe, a fixed asset would be something like a barista machine. It would be the table and chairs. It would be items such as the teacups and so forth, and coffee cups, etc., that you need to have as essential parts of you actually going out there and making your ultimate revenue from selling things. The other type of resource that we have is inventory. And inventory comes in two flavors. It comes in raw materials. Think of the coffee beans, think of the milk, things that you're going to take and repackage. You also need to think of, they could come in the flavor of finished goods, things that you're on selling. Classic example of that would be something to do with maybe muffins, which you're not baking in store, but which you're buying from a baker or a bakery and you're reselling them. The domain of acquiring these resources for your business plan tend to be oftentimes outside of our individual control. So from a people perspective, acquiring people tends to be the domain of human resources. HR used to be known as personnel. Obtaining equipment, inventory, tends to be the domain of procurement, the buying function. They tend to have a set of governance approaches which they go through, or protocols that they go through, both from an organisation structure point of view and also from a legislative framework around how they go and acquire those associated resources. Do you need to be an expert in them? No, you don't. What you do need to know is two critical aspects of it. Number one, you need to understand how long it takes. What's the process that it goes through? And the reason you need to understand that is you are trying to establish around your metrics, your benefit statement, if you like, for why you're putting this proposal in place. You're trying to justify it not only in a dollar value, but also with a timeline. How soon will you achieve it? Understanding how long it takes you to get those resources will help you understand how soon they become productive. And when we talk about productive, we consultants tend to talk about you being productive at about a 65 to 75% efficiency ratio. You're never 100%. You might fluctuate up and down from 65 and 75%, but you'll tend to average out around that number. And you'll average out for a multiple number of reasons. Emails, we all get emails largely through the day. It is not something that we're doing productive. We have toilet breaks, we have lunch breaks. So the first and foremost thing that you want to understand for procurement in HR is how long will it take before you get a resource so that you can actually put it to work. The second thing you want to understand, and in particular from an HR perspective, is once you've got them, how long before they get to that 65 to 75% level efficiency? Do they need to go through an onboarding process or orientation process? So as soon as you hire somebody, you put them in class for a week while they orientate themselves with the company. If you're doing that, for that week, they're 0% productive. When you get them, what's your training protocol going to be? Do you need to, for example, as they do in many of the trades, if it's an apprentice that you're recruiting, do you need to put them with a tradesperson? If you do, how long do you need to do that for? If you do, what is the impact to both the productivity, that 65 to 75% number, for both the tradesperson and indeed the apprentice. So these are things that you need to consider in terms of time associated with your resource acquisition. The other thing you need to consider or understand is who is involved in the selection. What is the process through HR? What is the process through procurement? Why you need to do that is it will tell you who is involved. And who is involved is very important so that you can help influence who gets selected as winner. Yes, you may not be able to specifically say, pick this. So for example, if there's an approved vendor list, you may not be able to say, pick somebody not on the vendor list. But what you can do is you can influence direction. And that's very important, particularly if your influencing direction is critical to the type of resource that you're after for your associated business plan. So we've covered off important component parts that you need to consider in terms of building your business plan. What we want to talk about now is the actual packaging of it, the documenting of it, whether that be in a written format, whether it be in a presentation format, whether it be some video format. And that typically, that format will be dictated by your governance. There will hopefully be some sort of organization assets or reusable assets around format that you need to use for your business report. And you want to find that. You want that. Because if you are starting from scratch, it means time that you need to get to know the stakeholders, to understand what needs to go into that particular business report to meet their needs. Time in terms of developing that format. Again, the maturity model would indicate those that are optimized tend to have some sort of structure, some sort of reusable assets. Those that aren't tend to do them off ad hoc, hence takes longer to do. We in this class will have a format, and after you've done assessment 1, you will receive a template coming from me, which will be the format which you will use for going in and actually building your particular business report. That will be our governance that you will have to do. When we look at business report itself, we broke it down into 3 primary components: the executive summary, the core body, and the conclusion. And the core body we tend to break down even more. When we look at the core body will have all of the detail elements around SWOT analysis, around justification for your change, around any considerations that need to have in terms of gaining support for your business plan. The 2 other ones, though, the executive summary and the conclusion, I typically regard as being more important. If you don't open well and close well, the body it can be superfluous. It can be something which is not necessarily focused on. You lose the meaning of your message if you're not directed enough. Let's start with the easy one first. Let's talk about the conclusion. You have to consider that you are presenting your cafe franchise to somebody who is more senior than you, somebody who is a senior executive that you're trying to gain credibility around. Your closing should be what specific action you're after from them. Don't leave them in doubt. Put it in there as to what you're looking to achieve from actually delivering that report to them. And typically what you're trying to get is approval, funding, and support. Hopefully you get all 3. Maybe you only get a couple. But that's what you should be looking for with your conclusion. The executive summary is something which is not an introduction. It's not like a story. It's where you start off with a once upon a time, and then you go and introduce everybody to the characters, and then you develop the plot, you reach the climax, and you conclude it. You close out the story. In doing the executive summary, you should firstly do it last. And you should consider the executive summary to be the only part of that report that that particular person will read. Now, is that a negative? No, it's not a negative. In real life, if you're presenting to senior executives, they get multiple reports. If you don't grab them straight away, they won't read further. So you need to sell the proposal in the executive summary. You need to sell a reasoning why they should want to read more of your report. And that involves you getting to the punchline, getting to, firstly, what is your change, what's driving it, what the cost of it is, and what the benefit. What is it driving? And it needs to be specific to the particular stakeholder. So you may find that if you have to go through multiple layers and you are able to put a different proposal into those layers, that you may be taking the same innovation and directing a different report to each of the layers, with the target focus being on specifically their needs. Those things that you identified by doing the SWOT analysis. So the executive summary, again, consider it as something that maybe they won't read the rest of the report, where you need to be able to sell your argument concisely up front. So that brings us to an end for our video for this week. If last week was about understanding, then this week was about credibility. Gaining credibility to not only your innovation, but also to your proposal and to your report. Gaining credibility for yourself. Next week we switch gears from you've now got approval to actually going and getting the job done. What does it mean from an implementation perspective? And also, very importantly, what it means from a monitoring perspective, so that we can predict where we're going to end up, predict what our likely outcome is going to be, and make the associated changes to our business plan.